I used to live on an old farm where the farmhand squatters had been made into a rental apartment. We felt a strong and unwelcoming presence in the apartment at night, movements and such too, but the absolute impressive experience were the horse ghosts. After living there for some time, the owner renewed the old stables to be rented out for horses. Shortly after, 3 horses took residency there, and not long after, we heard it for the first time. Around 8 p.m., we heard a horse walk into the courtyard. We both jumped up and ran out, believing a horse had gotten loose. I ran to the stables, and my ex ran out to look after the horse. When he rapidly pulled open the door to the stables, I saw 3 shocked horses looking back at me with a puzzled expression. My ex hadn't seen anything either, so he shrugged and went back to bed. The day after, it happened again. This time, we ran to the windows and looked out from both sides, but there was nothing, only the vaguely lit darkness. A couple of days went by before we heard it again, and we got used to it and accepted it as it was, the spirit of a horse coming to visit its friends. It kept happening at random, though the time we lived there was always around 8 p.m. Even our neighbor, who was a stern, non-spiritual mechanic, heard it and totally lost her mind when she found out we heard it too. A while later, we learned the farm had burned down many years ago, and we assumed the poor horse had perished then. When suddenly new horses arrived, it found some new friends.
One time, me and 2 other friends from Miami went to my home in Nebraska to visit my grandmother because she wasn't doing well. She passed later that month, and one night, me and my friend went out on a drive while my other friend stayed with my grandma to check on her every once in a while. Me and my friend had gone to go out. I don't remember to get what exactly. Probably milk. We had taken a wrong turn, and at this part, it almost seemed like out of a movie. Our radio stopped working. It was about 9 p.m., and we were in the middle of a random dirt road in nowhere, Nebraska. Me and my friend got out of the car to see our surroundings because there wasn't any service. After about 5 minutes of being outside the car, we saw a very large deer jumping around in the field to our right side. I get my buddy to look at the deer when he sees it. It was maybe 50 yards away from us, about half a football field. The deer has seen us too. It all goes silent. The deer starts to let out this loud scream that almost sounds like an elk but a lot more human-like, which goes on for 15 seconds. And in the middle of it, he starts to stand on his 2 legs and runs at us. We get back in the car quickly and drive away as fast as we can. I remember distinctly that sometime in the middle of our panic, our radio starts to come on and it's playing Hungry Like the Wolf by Duran Duran. It was one of my favorite songs, but now I can't listen to it without remembering that scene. We came straight home and I pulled my friend to the side, and me and my other friend told him the story of what had happened. And throughout the whole time, he thought we were lying. I think at some point he started to believe the story, but it was by far the creepiest thing I had ever seen. I just can't begin to describe how it was, at least 9 foot tall and running like a human on 2 legs. Such a distinctive scream.
This story took place over the summer. My friend Jeremy had the house all to himself for the week, and he invited me to spend the weekend with him. Since we were both 15, having the house to ourselves was great. I arrived at his house on Friday night. Jeremy's 2 younger brothers, Sam and Isaac, were also there, but we didn't really mind as they stayed out of our way. Around 9:30, Sam and Isaac wanted to play hide-and-seek in the dark outside. Jeremy's house is located at the far end of his neighborhood, and behind his house, there are woods. We agreed, grabbed flashlights, and headed to the woods. Sam and I continued first while Jeremy and Isaac ran into the woods and hid. After about a minute, we went looking for them. For around 5 minutes, both of us walked around and shone our flashlights all over the place, hoping to find them. We soon reached a small trail that led away from our path, which was odd because I couldn't recall ever seeing it before. We followed it, and a minute later appeared on a small clearing, and in front of us, maybe 30 yards away, was an odd-looking shack. It appeared abandoned, was rather small, and the wood was old and charred. The steps leading to the front door were well run down, and the windows had shattered glass. Both of us looked unsure as we stared at the shack. Something wasn't right. None of us had ever gone this deep into the woods, let alone at night, but we also thought that this was where Jeremy and Isaac had hidden. We both walked slowly to the shack. I hopped onto the porch and made a loud creaking noise. I heard movement coming from inside. Sam stayed back, and I nodded to him, indicating they must be inside. I went over to one of the broken windows, careful to avoid the glass. I peeked inside the shack, shining my light inside, and screamed in horror when I saw a figure hunched in the far corner. His eyes darted to where I was as the light shone on him. He had a scruffy beard, wide-eyed, and wore a heavy brown coat. But what terrified me the most was when his mouth curled into a sinister smile the moment he saw me. I got off the porch and Sam began to ask what was wrong, but I yelled at him to run. We ran and reached the end of the path and ran back in the direction of Jeremy's house. I saw 2 pairs of lights in front of us, and seconds later we saw Jeremy and Isaac. I frantically explained to them about the shack and what I saw. Both didn't believe me, but before I could explain any more, we heard branches being crushed behind us and heavy footsteps getting closer. We all sprinted away and immediately reached the house. Jeremy quickly unlocked the door, and we all bolted in. We stayed silent for a moment before explaining what I had seen. We were all still a bit scared and felt uneasy, especially considering that the footsteps we heard were most likely that same man from the shack. We turned on a movie to try to calm ourselves down and forget what had happened. At 20 past midnight, the movie was ending. We saw one of the lights from the back porch turn on. We had a clear view of the back porch from where we were all sitting. The lights were the ones that turn on when movement is detected. Jeremy and I got up and slowly went towards the back porch screen door to see. We pulled the curtains and gasped when we saw a large figure hopping the fence. I was worried and scared as I thought it was the same man from the shack. We debated on what to do, but I decided that if it was indeed the same man, we had to call the cops, as he now knew where we lived. 2 officers arrived at Jeremy's house, and we explained to them the whole situation about the shack and the man being in the backyard. A separate cop was called, and 2 of them went to search the woods while 1 cop stayed with us. After half an hour, the 2 officers returned and told us they found the shack but no man. However, they did find meth, a sleeping bag, a candle, and a hunting knife. The cops said the man was probably some homeless meth addict who would use the shack as a place to stay. To this day, I still wonder what the man was doing when he entered the backyard, and what he would have done if we had all gone to sleep and didn't notice the porch light turn on.
Let me start off by saying that this happened 8 years ago when I was 15 on a mule deer hunt in the far northeastern part of Utah, which contains some of the most remote and beautiful places in the state. I've been frequently out in this area, spreading in Summit County that cuts in and out of lower Wyoming since before I can remember, including lots of hiking, backpacking, camping, hunting, and being involved in some of my grandfather's work. I am skeptical of things not proven by methods of science, but I don't deny all of those things. I find it's impossible for science to know all that is out there in our vast world. My grandfather is a recently retired biologist and former conservation officer for the state, and was a regional specialist of wildlife and habitat management for many years. He's done everything from habitat management programs, controlled fires to benefit areas, to quite literally wrangling moose to be transplanted and darting black bears. He's seen mountain lions, bears, birds of all kinds, small mammals, remnants plants, and natural phenomena for the majority of his life. And he understands so much that many people, including myself, will never be able to even begin to imagine. He's scientific, honest, straightforward, level-headed, agnostic, and not superstitious, and often used to lovingly and respectfully tease a certain coworker who thinks Bigfoot, skinwalkers, and other cryptid beings exist. Other than this experience, he has never encountered an animal that he could not at least partially, if not completely, identify. Other than the natural, innate fear of being in close quarters with a bear, drunken, belligerent hunters, or incredibly potent tranquilizer medication, He's told me over and over he's never been terrified of an animal or experience like this, only curious or surprised. It was late September, and we were in a small camp by a lake in the high winter mountains, hunting both grouse and mule deer with muzzle loaders. The camp was a small collection of men and women my grandfather had worked with over the years, a supervisor biologist and others, people I'd grown up with as well. One of the women, a new wife to one of the guys, had shot a big deer, injuring but not killing it immediately, and they had lost track of it. Devastated by the thought of wasting the animal, she returned to camp in the afternoon upset and concerned that the deer had run into an even more secluded area of the mountains, which was hard to reach from the trail that she had shot from. A place my grandfather was familiar with because it was such a pain in the ass to get to with lots of deadfall and steep terrain. We volunteered to go in the late afternoon to search for the deer, following a scant blood trail that she had tracked for a while before getting fatigued and intimidated by the terrain. Because both my grandfather and I were in good shape and he was so familiar, it didn't seem like a big deal. Before we left, she mentioned hearing coyotes and that she assumed they were in the area, which made her even more concerned that if the deer lived, they would ruin the meat and hide before she could harvest it. We took off in the early evening, expecting to be back within an hour or two after searching and having our weapons with us in case we found the animal still alive or came across another buck worth trying to harvest. It was steep in some places with lots and lots of deadfall of varying heights, making the hike slower and more tedious than we had hoped, making us understand the other hunters' fatigue. She had marked the blood trail with bright orange paint on the trees, which we followed for 20 minutes, and then it got harder to track. The sun was getting close to setting at this point, and we knew getting out would be just as long as going in. We had just about decided to stop when we found a spot near a fallen tree that looked like it had been recently bedded down in, followed with spatters of fairly fresh blood, and we continued for longer. When the sun had just about set and the light had faded from the trees, we removed the firing caps from our guns to make them completely safe, as it was now illegal and irresponsible to hunt in such absence of decent light. My grandfather pulled out his large mag light flashlight from his backpack, and I put my headlamp on to begin the hike back, using our GPS to find the trailhead. 10 minutes later, on the way back, we started to hear more movement among the trees. It was normal for animals to start moving now that the sun had gone down, as animals would likely be starting to head towards a clearing for water or to graze in the safety of lower lights. Small and distant sounds of crunching leaves, patterings of hooved animals, or small bits of movement of the trees from squirrels or birds were common. We did not expect to hear the deafening, disturbing sound of what we heard next, which vaguely and initially reminded me of a coyote howl, but by a few seconds, it was unidentifiable, frightening, and human-like. It started with what sounded like a person screaming, but then got louder and more intense with a screech to it, so unlike any coyote or any animal we had ever heard. Then there was the chittering that came in between the shrieks, and the movement of the trees becoming almost calculated, almost threatening. We stopped dead in our tracks, frozen, as my grandfather started using the light to look around. I was far more freaked out than him at this point. He just seemed perplexed, curious, and a little baffled at what could make that sound. It sounded human, but with no words, no urgency, no tone of help, or, "I'm screaming just to mess with you." We continued on after it mostly stopped, and it seemed like the other natural and distant sounds had gone almost silent. I listened intently to the sound of my boots crunching with the dry aspen leaves underfoot, trying to tell myself that it was just some weird coyote with a horribly deformed larynx or something. Maybe 20 minutes from the main trail that would lead us back to the truck, we heard the chittering sound again and the sounds of thumping against dead trees. Looking around us with our lights in between, deadfall maybe 12 to 15 feet in front of us was a large human-looking thing. It was almost hunched down with long, slender arms. Its body was pale with grayish patches of hair. I caught a very brief glimpse of its face. It was sunken in around the eyes, and its face seemed emaciated. I never felt like it looked right at me or my grandfather, just in our direction, almost confused and curious. I looked down at the ground, holding my eyes shut tight, trying to imagine being safe and secure in the truck, and my grandfather took a few stumbling steps backwards towards me. I heard the thing go off, moving quickly and with purpose through the trees to the side, and then drop down behind us. That's what I would assume, according to the sound, but I hoped it went in the opposite direction. My grandfather turned to where it had veered off as if to follow it, but he soon stopped and looked at me. I have never before and never since seen him so confused, baffled, horrified, curious, and in awe. I was crying at this point, ugly crying, trying to muffle my shaking breath and voice, and I asked him, "What was that?" over and over. Yet he had no answer for me. He pulled his gun off his shoulder and put a cap back on the igniter, making the gun live, and then he carried it in front of his body. He pulled out another headlight and put it on himself. We started walking again towards the trail as he mumbled, almost like talking to himself, to what it wasn't. Things like, "Could have been a deer or elk. Moose had arms. It was hunched. It stood upright. Or a bear, a very sick bear. It could have been a bear. Was it the light?" We heard the sound, the screeching human howl, distant once more before reaching the trail, which was dirt and gravel but fairly flat and no deadfall. We practically jogged to the trunk. I locked the doors immediately and sobbed, and my grandfather turned on music as loud as possible to try and distract me on the way back to camp. I was a mess when we arrived back, and he went to talk with the others by the fire. When he got me settled in my sleeping bag in my bunk, he explained to some of his friends, but I don't know what they all said. The next day, everyone was extra sweet to me, trying to comfort me, saying it was probably a sick animal that looked scary in the dark. The deer that the lady shot was found the next day in the daylight, scavenged by what I assume was coyotes. To this day, he has no clue what it was, nor what that sound was, and before and since I've heard both coyote and many other animal sounds that never even compared to that one. The scientist in me and in him, the hopeful and blissfully ignorant people in us, hope and speculate it was just a deformed, sick animal in scant light. But I have no clue of what that thing was, and I hope I never experience it again. Does anyone have any ideas?
This happened 2 years ago in July in Poland, where me and my brother live. I got a call from my aunt if I could go and meet her where she works. I agreed, and after 30 minutes went to see her. She asked me if I could look over the place where she worked because she needed to leave and see her boyfriend Andrew. I asked why, and she explained that just before she called me, Andrew had called her. He and 2 of his friends, Henry and Ethan, were on a road trip not too far from where we live. They decided that they wanted to do a short trip and shoot some wind cheetah guns for fun. They decided to drive to a point on the hill where a small old bunker is. The bunker is so small that only 2 people can enter, and it's only one room with windows fronting every direction. It's there because of the World War, and we live on the border of Germany. My aunt said that for now, that's all she knows, and she needs to go to them because somehow they can't leave, and that they were scared to their core. I stayed at her place of work, which is a cigarette shop, and waited for her to return. They got back 10 minutes later, and as I said before, they were closer to our location when they left. The car my aunt's boyfriend sat in front of the shop with his friends, and they were pale from fear. And when I say pale, I mean their faces were basically white, and they weren't saying a word. I waited patiently for them to tell me what had happened. When they arrived at the spot, nothing was wrong. They went out of the car and started to prepare the air guns. They went onto the roof of the bunker, which was around 1.5 meters high, and started to shoot for fun. They were shooting the rocks, not people, because there was no one around. And as they finished, they started going down from the bunker, and it was in that moment that they noticed something very strange. Their car was standing there in plain sight, around 10 meters from where they were shooting from. At first glance, nothing had changed, but then one of them noticed that there were bricks piled up from the ground up to the chassis of the car around every single wheel. It was like they had driven straight into the middle of some kind of wall. But let's not forget that it was an area close to an old bunker with an old dirt road, and there was 0% of possibility that they had not noticed it. After leaving the car, all three of them had run straight into the car and locked themselves in. Andrew was the one who was driving that day, and he started the car normally, but the vehicle just wouldn't move. Like these little walls around the wheel was strong enough to prevent them from driving away. They all started panicking at that point. Ethan ran out the car and started kicking the bricks to set the car free. At some point, he was certain that it was enough, and that the walls were destroyed to the point that maybe they could leave now. He entered the car, Andrew tried again, but now the car wouldn't even start. The third guy called a friend from a city near to their location and asked if they could tow their car. He agreed, but after 10 to 15 minutes, called them back. He was standing on the road down the hill and was seeing them. He called to ask for directions because somehow he couldn't find the way that led up to the hill. At some point he started screaming that something out in the woods was near them and was running straight for the car. Henry said that the guy was screaming like he was scared for his life. The only problem was that they were not seeing anything running at them. Nothing had left the woods, which they were all seeing from close up. At this point, they were all screaming, and it was very hectic. The funny thing is that the guy who was supposed to be helping them just hung up and left them there. After a few minutes of straight-up panic, they managed to stay quiet for a moment just to try and hear if anything is walking nearby. And after a few seconds of silence, something knocked on the window of the car. The knock sounded like it was made by something metallic and large. It was the window on the right side of the car facing the forest. It was at that point Andrew called my aunt, and then she called me and went together. Andrew was really scared while telling us what had happened, but it wasn't the strangest thing. The weirdest thing is that his two buddies were silent and hadn't spoken a word since they'd arrived at my aunt's job. She told me a few weeks later that they were pretty strange after the incident. No one is talking about that day anymore, so I'm still curious about what actually happened there. To my knowledge, the bricks are still there.
I went hiking out in the wilderness on the outskirts of Yuma and walked about 5 miles from my car to my campsite. I brought my usual hiking gear along with my AR-15 for protection against wild animals like coyotes or snakes. My firewood supply burned up just after the sun went down, so I went to bed at around 6:30, messed around on my phone till 7:30, passed out, and was awoken at 8:30 by a call from our mutual friend. I fell asleep again. The next time I woke up, I couldn't move. I could hear rocks moving outside and soft footfalls in the sand right outside my tent. I heard coyotes howling earlier, so I knew that's what these were. I was sleeping with my back to the wall of the tent, and one of them pressed their nose into my back and sniffed for a good minute. I had sleep paralysis again, and I couldn't even grab my rifle to shoot them. The second thing happened a few hours later. There are 2 sections of my tent that can be seen through. It had to be a dream, but I woke up and peered through the window, and I saw a young woman and a child sitting outside my tent on a small rise not more than 6 feet away. I asked them who they were, and the child was silent, but the woman declared, "Leave this place." They made a horrifying face, and as I went to grab my rifle, I tried to pull the trigger, but it dawned on me that something was terribly wrong, and the trigger wouldn't budge. And then the child stood up and walked away into the trees behind my tent, and the woman walked on until I couldn't see her anymore. But the child passed out from under the moonlight to the shadow of the trees, and because there was moonlight falling on the other side, I could watch her silhouette change shape. She became a gangly, bony freak, almost like a tall monkey. Absolutely silent, and she rushed my tent. I squeezed the trigger for all it's worth, and then she collided with my tent. In that instant, I woke up screaming and throwing a wild punch at the wall of the tent. I think whatever it was followed me. I've never been hiking to that spot again, and maybe never will try again. Back in 2009, I was in a band that toured the country in a 15-passenger van with a trailer. We were on our way from Cleveland, Ohio to Cincinnati. The show had been canceled in Cleveland due to a power outage, so we decided to get on the road early as we had a friend in Cincinnati who was taking us in for the night. While on the highway, about 25 minutes outside of Cincinnati, I'll never forget this moment for the rest of my life. We were all pretty much alert and actively having a conversation. There were 8 of us in total in the van, when the driver and passenger both shouted simultaneously, "What the hell is that?" I'm getting goosebumps just thinking about it. I was sitting with my back against the window, and I didn't see anything, but we heard a whooshing noise, as if something flew over the van. My friend who was sitting next to me looked like he'd just seen a ghost. We wound up pulling over on this side of the road because everyone was freaking out, thinking we hit something, but nothing was found. Both the passenger and the driver said they saw a tall black figure lunge at the van from the shoulder of the left lane. My friend who was sitting next to me said the same thing. No, I don't think they're all playing a hoax on the unknowing members because I know these guys, and they were scared out of their minds. We arrived at our destination, the house that we were staying at. Power was also out. The next day, we inspected the van in daylight and noticed there were streak marks across the roof of the van. Our van was white and also very dirty due to touring the entire country. Still to this day, we don't know what we witnessed. We've done some search on it, and similar reports have happened in and around the same area. I was reading the book, The Mothman Prophecies, around the time of the tour as well, and I'm quite convinced that we had an encounter with the unexplained.
This particular event happened to me when I was around 10 or 11 years old, but I have been visiting my grandma's cabin in Big Bear Lake several times a year since I was a child. This isn't the first strange event to happen to me there, but it is definitely the most memorable. A little backstory. My grandma's cabin sits at the end of a cul-de-sac, right at the edge of a vast, mostly unpopulated stretch of forest. No matter what I do or how I'm feeling, I always have a very strong sensation that I'm being watched when I'm in many of the rooms in the cabin alone, day or night. I've seen shadow creatures many times in the cabin, have heard strange knocking, whispers, and just generally feel like there is something else living there with us. My grandma has told me of similar experiences and has warned me before that if I ever get a strange feeling when I'm walking in the forest, to go home immediately. But she never elaborated. Anyway, me and my dad and uncle were walking on a trail that we've been on hundreds of times before. When we reached the first peak of the hill that we usually like to stop and look out at the view, my dad and uncle wanted to keep hiking for a bit, but I decided to go back to the cabin on my own, as it was only about 10 minutes away. I headed down the usual path that I go on, not thinking much about it. When I realized I had no idea where I was, everything looked the same as usual, but something was wrong. The normal path was different in a way I can't really explain. It seemed to be 10 times as long as usual. Everything was silent, and there was absolutely no wildlife sound, not even a squirrel. I kept having all of these morbid thoughts coming into my head about how I was lost forever, or some sort of creature was going to swoop me up. Every 10 or so minutes, I ended up at a part of the trail that I definitely recognized, only to be in a completely alien area moments later. The path kept winding and winding downhill, and the sun was setting pretty rapidly. I had to have been walking in the direction of the cabin for more than an hour, because I remember I kept checking my watch and panicking. At this point, I just accepted that I was lost. I finally made it down to the street, and was relieved to be able to orient myself, but I was only 1 street away from the cabin, although I should have been much further away. I was expecting my father and uncle to be home by now, and for my parents to be worried about me being gone for so long. But instead, my mother asked me why I was home so soon. I asked my dad how long they were out there, but they said that they'd only walked maybe 15 minutes longer from when I left. I don't know if I'm just reading too much into this, and if I were a kid with different perceptions, but something definitely felt very off about that entire ordeal.
I was at work one day, and me and my colleague went for a cigarette. When we came back, we had a few minutes left and decided to take the elevator to the canteen. All the way down the hall, there was a woman walking about 10 feet ahead of us. The lift door opened and this lady walks into the elevator but does not turn around, and the lift doors start to close. At this point, wanting to get into that elevator to not let any further time pass, I run up to the button and pressed it in order for the lift doors to open before it starts going down. They begin to open again, and when the lift doors are fully open, my colleague and I walk in, and the lady was gone. We got to it before the doors closed fully, and there's nowhere she could have gone in broad daylight. I decided not to work evenings there anymore after this creepy occurrence.